All right. Well, welcome everyone once again to another episode of Deliberations Live, where today we're going to be answering our most recent All Rise episode entitled Objection, Matt Dillahunty Asked and Answered, where Abdu talked about Euthyphro's dilemma. So I'm your host, Derek Caldwell, once again, joined with author and speaker, apologist Abdu Murray. So Abdu, how you doing?
Doing great.
I know that was one of the we called out for questions on Instagram. One of them was, how you doing?
Yeah. And so to answer your question, doing quite well. Thank you. Doing quite well.
Well, that one's going to be controversial.
Yeah. Now I stepped in it.
Yeah.
Actually, it's funny. I was just thinking, I want to say this, and I may have said this in an episode, and I don't remember if I did or didn't. But I actually did it. So I did a debate with Matt Dillahunty years ago. At West Texas A&M University, very well attended, mostly by people who knew who Matt was, because no one knew who I was. And my guess is far fewer people know who I am than know who Matt is, even to this day. It was an excellent debate. Matt and I had dinner with our hosts as well and our sponsors ahead of time. And we, at least on my end, I can say, I hope you feel this way, Matt, if you ever watch this, I had a very pleasant time. With him. He's thoughtful. We had a wonderful conversation and an engaging debate during which we disagreed quite a bit. But and the debate was an unusual topic. It was, should America be a nation under God? Which is, political now, and it gets a little, it sort of has the ring of equating evangelicalism with politics and all that stuff, which is interesting because now that would be a controversial topic and well attended, but I think a little more incendiary just because of the current climate we're in. But then that wasn't the issue. And the argument did end up becoming a moral argument question. I did not take a historical thing based on this. It was more of a moral argument attack on it. But I will say we had a really good time. And in fact, I think afterwards, Matt said he would, he'd welcome a chance to have another dialogue or debate with me again at some point, which I would welcome, provided the schedules work out. Because they don't always work out, and he's probably a busier guy than I am. But in any event, I just want to say I had a really, really pleasant time, and wonderful interaction with people afterwards as well. This was, of course, years ago. So if you want to check out that debate, I'm sure it's on YouTube somewhere, and we're probably going to get it on our channel at some point. But it was at West Texas A&M. I don't remember the year, but it's been good 7 or 8, maybe even 10 years.
Type in both of their names, and it is out there and easy to find. But he seems like a guy that would be really fun to hang out with. Actually,
well, we hung out with for a short period of time, so I can say that it was very, very pleasant. And he was very kind and thoughtful with me.
Great,
absolutely
great. Well, just want to say hello to Tyron. I think that's how I. From YouTube, and then Gregory, our friend Gregory, is doing much better after surgery.
Good.
We prayed for Gregory in our staff prayer time.
We did.
What is today? Yeah, last week.
Today's Monday.
We've got it together.
Yeah.
So, I had a very long weekend, but so awesome to hear that, Gregory. Well, let's jump right in then, because we've got a lot of great questions to get to, and people are very passionate about this one because Matt has a lot of fans who wanted to sort of like take us to task on some of the claims that were made, and you expect that, just as we would feel just as passionate about, and obviously we felt passionate enough to respond to his video, so it's kind of that. But I know you got one from Instagram from Anne Marie. Another friend of the show. Why don't we start with her question?
Sure, she's really good. I got a couple of them, but let me pull it up here. The first one I got was on Instagram from Anne Marie, and she basically said, here's a question from a friend who does not believe in God, who's an atheist. And the question is, why does morality become objective with a God? Isn't this the same purpose our social contracts serve? In other words, seems to me, and it's a great question, actually, and it goes to the heart of what we were talking about in the episode. And I've spoken about this quite a bit and written about it, both online and books and stuff like that. What about God, rooting it in God, makes it objective? But the social contract angle is really, really interesting, and I'm glad your friend raised it, because I've actually spoken on social contract theory quite a bit. Social contract theory is just the legal way. When you look at legal theorists and why we have what's called the state of nature, which is essentially out there, nature is red in tooth and claw, to quote Alfred Lord Tennyson, where you see a might makes right kind of existence. So you have the state of nature, and then you have the state of civilization. And so social contract theorists, Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, all these folks who talk about these kind of ways in which we move out of the state of nature, where might makes right, where the strong dominate the weak. We need to move from that as human beings, because we don't want the strong to dominate the weak and that be the way it is. We want the weak to have a voice. We want those who might have disadvantages to not succumb to a sort of a brute strength, a brute forced kind of reality of life. So we move into social contract, and social contract basically says, this is a very simplified version of it, but if you don't do bad things to me, I won't do bad things to you. And if you do good things for me, I'll do good things for you. And then, of course, it reciprocates. If you don't do bad things to me, no harm will befall you from my end. I'll even defend you if I have to. We'll form allies and all these kind of things in social contract. That's almost the entire basis of the international law system, the international justice system as well. So, but you'll notice something. It's extraordinarily self-seeking or self-protective. There's not a whole lot of self-sacrifice involved in that, because social contract basically says we're in a scary world where things are bad. And if we don't ally ourselves with each other, if the weak don't ally themselves with the strong, or if the weak don't conglomerate so that they can take on the strong, because collectively the weak might be strong as a collective, don't do that, bad things will happen. Or we won't get the goods we're supposed to have as well. But I want you to notice something, a couple of things about that. First, social contract, as I said before, is extremely give to get. It's self-seeking or it's self-protective. And nothing's inherently wrong with those things, but that's the inherent thing that's going on with that. But second, in this kind of thing, it acknowledges something about the way the world actually is. When human beings are left to their own devices, they will eat each other. We will dominate the weaker. Now, someone might say, but they were left to their own devices and they came up with social contract, which is a way for us to help each other and get out of, and sort of, we have the ability to rise above our bad natures and that kind of thing. One thing is this: social contract doesn't make morality objective. It makes it utilitarian. So if I'm involved in a social contract where, if I don't do bad things to you, Derek, you won't do bad things to me. I might do that for completely selfish interests, like I have a disadvantage over you in some ways. Maybe I'm not as clever, or I'm not as strong, or I'm not as fast. And you'll say, okay, but you got a couple of things too. Maybe you make friends better than I do. And therefore, because you can ally yourself with other people who might be more powerful than me, I want to enter into this contract for you as well. There's nothing objectively moral about it. It's just convenient. Yeah. It's just a way to avoid bad consequences. And I don't mean bad in an objectively moral sense. I mean in a consequentialist sense, or in a the consequences aren't favorable to you. But that doesn't make those consequences objectively true. It just means that for you, you don't like them. And for me, I don't like the bad consequences. And for me, I like these ones and you like these. And so we'll try to have this contract. We'll work these things out for our mutual benefit. But there's nothing moral about it. It's like a parasitic relationship in some senses, where you have that remora that sort of sticks to the bottom of a shark and cleans the shark of whatever junk collects on sharks. And the shark lets it live there, and it's good for the shark and it's good for the remora. It's not morally good for the remora. It's just convenient for the remora. Right. So if social contract is the best we can do, then it's not moral. It's just convenient. But on top of that, people break the social contract all the time. And there's no obligor. There's no one to whom we're obligated above ourselves, other than ourselves. And so you have like an International Court of Human Rights, where a rogue state or even a superpower might do something that impinges upon the sovereignty of another nation, and or there's human rights abuses happening within that nation. And so a conglomeration of nations say, we're going to sanction this person, or we're going to bring a complaint against them in the International Court of Human Rights, and bring charges against them, and then issue statements and make all this stuff. And that sovereign nation says, well, I don't buy it. I'm not going to abide by your rules, or I don't want to be a part of your treaty organization. Now what? Now it's not social contract anymore. It's, it's fighting or whatever it is. We're in that state right now. All over the world. And of course, the most notable one is Russia and the Ukraine. Russia decides, we want that. That's ours. We get it. And the Ukraine's like, no, we're us. And most of the world, it seems, sides with Russia. But all it takes is for one ally to say, no, sorry, all the world, sorry, I said that backwards. Most of the world sides with the Ukraine. But all it takes is enough superpowers of large-scale populations to say, we side with Russia. And now we have a problem, don't we? And I want you to notice something, that human beings are deciding who's right and who's wrong here. And it doesn't really become objective anymore. Just because there's a social contract that we can break all the time doesn't make it objective. It just makes it convenient. So the morality behind the contract is subjective. It's not non-existent. It's just not what we would call objective. There's no transcendent quality to it at all. I think that's a really good, hopefully, not really good, I should say. Hopefully it's a helpful understanding of how social contract and us agreeing to certain things just doesn't work.
And would you say, just as a quick follow-up, that, because I want to read a quote here, but from Tom Holland, but is social contract and sort of the idea that like the social contracts that we see seem to be good social contracts and have these human rights and intrinsic human values attached to them. Are those running off of the fumes of a Christian past, but that Christian past is being further and further in the past, so we might run into problems? Because Tom Holland went searching for, he's an atheist, a historian, loved ancient civilization, classical civilization, the Roman society, so all this, he was very, his imagination was full of this, and the pomp and circumstance and the power, but he assumed that he'd go back and study it, and that's where he'd find his morals. But he wrote in an article called "Why I Was Wrong About Christianity," he said, "Today, even as belief in God fades across the West, the countries that were once collectively known as Christendom continue to bear the stamp of the 2 millennia-old revolution that Christianity represents. It is the principal reason why, by and large, most of us who live in post-Christian societies still take for granted that it is nobler to suffer than to inflict suffering. It is why we generally assume that every human life is of equal value. In my morals and ethics, I have learned to accept that I am not Greek or Roman at all, but thoroughly and proudly Christian." And so that's, it's one of those where I think sometimes in questions like this, people may hear us saying atheists can't be moral,
right? We're not saying that.
And we're not saying that, but it does get into, do you think that social contracts, that's where they're going to break down? If they're sort of removing that, what is objective, which we would say is God, who has, like you said, the power to enforce. I guess.
Because they break down, it's at the point where the whole point of social contracts is to get out of the state of nature where might makes right, or in fact, it doesn't even make right. It just makes advantage, a survival advantage. And in essence, if all the mighty in the world decided these countries are going to serve us, and let's say that happened, and is that really a far-fetched thing to think? It's happened in the past. Let's say all of them got together in a world where we have such connectivity, and they said, we're going to do this now, and these certain people, they're going to be subject to us, and their interests are subject to us. If the majority of people thought it, then the social contract is broken, or it's at least fundamentally changed, where the contract is no longer, we're going to operate on equal footing. We're going to operate on a footing where our footing is not equal. I happen to be stronger. You're going to do these things. And in a mob sort of mafia mentality, you, by submitting to us, will protect you from us. So there's no reason to think that social contract does anything more than just shuffle. I mean, I'm not saying it's irrelevant. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is I don't think that it does the trick, morally speaking, in terms of an objective morality. Okay. I think what Tom Holland is saying, and by the way, Tom Holland, not Spider-Man, right. But the historian and author, I think he's being very honest with where we get these ideas from in the first place, because we talk oftentimes about an increasingly secular world where we don't need God for this morality, because the more secular we get, we're not getting less and less moral. Whether that's true or not is another issue, by the way. But we're not saying that you have to be a Christian to be a moral person or to say and do moral things. We're not saying that. One, we're saying that philosophically speaking, and I think that this does have practical consequences, there's no philosophical reason. There's no there's no rational reason to be good or for good to exist. Mm-hmm. That we can, it's an illusion we conform ourselves to. Michael Ruse talks about this all the time, is that morality is just an illusion foisted upon you by your genes to get you to be a social cooperator. In other words, without God, the social contract mm-hmm. is not based on honor and truth and duty and morality. It's based on an illusion of those things, mm-hmm. which gets you into a socially and then genetically advantageous situation. Mm-hmm. But there's no obligation beyond your convenience for it. But social contract works, and works best if God is the transcendent source. In other words, if we feel ourselves obligated to a higher being whose authority is above our own, we're no longer subject to the social contract being altered. It's sort of, look, I'm a Star Wars nerd. I'm a Star Wars geek. And so I'm going to make a Star Wars reference. There's a scene in Empire Strikes Back where Darth Vader is walking with Lando Calrissian, and he made a deal with Lando about whether or not the Empire would take over his whole operation. And then Darth Vader changes the deal. And Lando says, that's not our deal. That's not our original deal. And Darth Vader looks at him with the ominous James Earl Jones voice in that sort of our black armor, says, I'm altering the deal. Pray I don't alter it any further. If Darth Vader is the ultimate authority, and he is this capricious sort of, there's no objective root in him, there's no transcendent root to his authority, then he becomes the superpower who changes the social contract. And that's what he did. But if he is obligated to an ultimate good, then what he does, though might not be judged in this life, maybe it will be, will ultimately have consequences that will show that his obligation was real.
Yeah, like I missed that one. I'm not much of a Star Wars nerd, but I was busy watching professional wrestling with the cool kids, and I guess I missed it.
Oh, you admitted on video.
Yeah, I just wanted to put that out there. So we got so there was a follow-up, I think, on what you were just saying here from Facebook, from Glenn Harris. He's asking, are you saying, I think this is what he means by this, are you saying reciprocity equals moral neutrality?
No, actually, reciprocity does not equal moral neutrality. It doesn't equal moral anything. I'm saying that it's an amoral thing, as opposed to immoral. So there's moral, then there's immoral, which is the opposite of moral, and then there's amoral, which is non-moral in other sense. In other words, my reciprocity with you, so for mutual benefit, mutual advantage, is not moral. It's just convenient. So it's not morally neutral. I guess in one sense it is. If it's amoral, it's morally neutral in the sense that morale. But what I'd say is that I wouldn't use the word morally neutral. I would say morality doesn't even factor in.
Yeah,
it's just a matter of what's good for you, kind of a thing. Like, it would be good if you became a doctor. Do you have to become a doctor?
Yeah.
There's no moral obligation for you to become a doctor. It would be good if I learned how to tap dance.
Yeah.
I have no intention of doing so. And no one's going to be harmed by that. But it would be good in terms of, it'd be cool if I was a true Renaissance man and I could do a lot of different things, including tap dance. But I don't have an obligation to do so. Right. The morality doesn't even factor in. So it's not morally neutral. It's just simply, it's non-moral.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we've got some other questions rolling in here, but I want to respond to some of the things that were on in the YouTube comments as well. Then we'll get back to some of the live questions.
Sure.
Because some people brought up some very interesting objections here. Glenn, who asked that, said, "Please don't take up tap dancing." He demands it. He said, "Do not take up."
I'm for your sake.
Yeah.
I've been
told, I don't know if it's a compliment or not, but I was always told when I tried to dance, I looked like a, quote, hog on ice. Do you think that's good?
I have a feeling that's not a compliment, but I'm not sure.
I thought it just meant fluid. But
it could mean that. It could mean that that's true. Or you take up so much of the dance floor.
Or accident prone.
Yeah.
Yeah. I really know how to throw my weight around on the dance floor. So Stanley asked this. He said, a moral act serves to improve the quality of life for the individual or individuals on the receiving end. In the Bible, there are multiple events where God killed off entire populations because they didn't do as he commanded, or simply because he needed to make room for his people. If you stay with the Bible as an example, a person murdering someone or a group of people for his own reason is, I think he means here, immoral. But if God ordered it, it was moral. It doesn't seem overly complicated to me. And I just want to add, someone else who was commenting added some specifics: slaughter of the Canaanites, slaughter of the Amalekites, the Great Flood. And of course, in the original video we're responding to, Matt Dillahunty said, even if God was the ground of morality, it couldn't be that God.
Yeah.
Because in the Bible, there are these violent, atrocious things going on. So that's a lot to answer, and the amount of each one of those could be an episode. And and I know that eventually we will get to each one of those.
Yeah, we will.
There may even be plans for that now.
Yeah, and now there's definitely plans for it.
Now there's definitely plans.
No, these are excellent questions.
Yeah, these are great questions.
Obviously, time being what it is in any particular episode, and podcasts don't necessarily have a time limit, except for the fact that people might be tired of listening to the thing, so you don't want to necessarily have it go ad infinitum. So you have to make some editing choices about what you can and can't say in the amount of time allotted.
Yeah.
So I appreciate that they brought this up. I actually do appreciate this. So can you read the first part of the question again? Because I think that there's a really he defines what morality is.
A moral act serves to improve the quality of life for the individual or individuals on the receiving end.
Okay. So first I want to talk about that. Is that definition that might be something it's workable. In other words, there's a livable definition of how we should act morally, but it makes assumptions. The whole point of the Youth for All objection is to say, where do we get morality from? And he's saying morality is this thing. Okay, I think that's true. But the reason I think that's true is not because that exists in nature. If animals, for example, or even one could argue if we're just sophisticated chimps, if we do anything that's good for another person, it's almost always sort of the selfish gene, or an Ayn Rand sort of selfish egoism thing where it's good for everybody because it's good for me. But it's not moral. It's just advantageous. Again, this is an important distinction. This is one that Michael Ruse actually understands. I think it understands well, is that you have to make a distinction between this is good in the sense that it's advantageous for the proliferation of a certain species of people and their progeny,
right?
Versus it's objectively morally good. So when beavers signal to the rest of the beavers that there's a predator in the area by thumping their tail in a way that puts them at risk, they're not doing it because the beavers are thinking about the moral good of saving more beavers and risking their own life for the sake of the genetic progress of beaverhood. It's instinct. It's purely instinct. We don't do that. There's a moral thing to us, and it's not just because of our empathy, because there'd be no good reason to do these kind of things. If these 70 plus years or 80 plus years now is all we're ever going to have, risking it for the possibility that someone might do well, seems a little bit like a weird gamble to make. I agree with the definition in one sense. I think there's a broader definition of morality there, but that only is moral if there is a transcendent source that says that the flourishing of other human beings is a good thing. It might be a convenient thing or a genetic thing, but again, that's advantageous versus good. So I think that definition already assumes the objective of existence of the moral values that he goes on to say is that God does things. In fact, I think he said it in his question. If I'm wrong, correct me. But he basically says God basically commands people to be killed or kills people. Great flood, the so-called genocide of the Canaanites, etc. Either because people didn't do what he said, or because he wanted to make room for people. I think in neither one of those two things is a fair characterization of. Let me just say this: not unfair. I don't want to accuse him of being unfair. What I want to say, I don't think that they're accurate representations of the biblical record of what's going on there. First, think about this. If God kills people for not doing what he said, in one sense, that is a moral thing he's done, because he didn't just say, hey, fold paper this way, or when you put your shirt on, make sure you button it up from the bottom instead of down from the top. Those are non-moral, amoral things. There's nothing moral about those things. Who he actually, quote unquote, kills, whether it's through other people or through floods or pestilence or whatever, are people who are acting horribly immoral and oppressing the weak, whether it's the Egyptians in their enslavement of the Hebrews, and in not only the enslavement of them, but the way they treated the Hebrews during their enslavement. Whether it was the Canaanites in their temple sacrifices and sacrificing children to their gods in terrible, terrible ways, whether it was temple prostitution and human trafficking, and the various other things that they were all guilty of. God didn't just say, meh, I guess that's going to have to be the way it is. He actually acted.
I don't want to look unloving.
I don't want to judge. Well, you can. Some things are worthy of your judgment. In fact, our questioner just judged God for doing certain things as immoral. So God has the right to judge certain things as immoral. And if we're positing a God and saying, if the God of the Bible exists, he's a horribly immoral being. Well, pause. If the God of the Bible exists, we're talking about a being who knows everything and is the creator of everything, and therefore has the right to act on his creation in a way that benefits the most people. So would allowing people who are acting horribly immorally to continue to flourish and expand, and in fact, not only expand just generally, but destroy a nation through whom the Messiah would come, who would save everybody from their sins, would that be a morally permissible act to just let it go? And Miroslav Volf, I don't have the quote exactly in front of me, but Miroslav Volf out of Yale University pointed out that based on what he had seen in his country and the way in which people were acting immorally and horribly, he said, I suddenly realized that, and I'm paraphrasing greatly, but if I suddenly realized that God didn't intervene when there was horrible evil happening, I would have to think that God is not loving, that such a God would not be worthy of my worship because he lets it go. And so God doesn't just kill people because they happen not to do some things. He kills them or removes them from the scene because they're not doing things that are not only not good for other people, but they're actually doing horribly immoral acts to other people. Now, I want to pause because someone might say, well, wait a minute, hold on. There's a couple of instances where it seems arbitrary. Like he kills that guy for touching the ark. And that seems terrible. Like, why would he kill a guy for doing that? One, I think there's a lot more context than just he kills a guy because he touches the ark. You look at the entirety of the context, and what you're seeing is God commands specifically, this thing is a holy thing, and you're supposed to do it this way and carry it this way and all these things. And they go ahead and they disobey everything God had said about how to actually transport the Ark of the Covenant, and there's this, and then they transport it incorrectly. Instead of carrying it themselves, they put it on this cart. It starts to break. It begins to fall in the mud, and the guy goes to stop it from falling in the mud. He suddenly, because they couldn't touch it, he suddenly takes it upon himself to touch it. And why is he touching it? Because he's gone against everything God has said to do. What is in this man's heart is for God to know. And his actions speak at least a little bit of what is actually in this man's heart. And he has become the sovereign of God. I don't care about what you, creator of the entire universe, say. I'm going to do it my way. And so he is judged for doing something terribly against the very nature of who God actually is. And so there's a lot more to say about this, but my point is that when God kills people for not obeying him, it's not just because you happen to, not have crops in the right order or these kind of things. Second, though, he doesn't just make room for his people. In fact, when you look at the biblical record, you see from the time that the Hebrews are brought out of Egypt and they're said, there's a promised land for you. Now, God, who I think knows all things, he would know all future actual events and all future counterfactual events and possible events. He knows what people would do and will do when certain things happen. So they still have free will. He commands the Hebrews, offer an olive branch to anybody you go to. And if they refuse the olive branch, you know their mind. And they are bent on war, and they're bent on keeping their evil practices going. And so you have the permission now to go to war with these people because of their horrible actions, and you've offered them an olive branch. Say, you're going to be judged for what you're doing, and we're going to be the instrument of that judgment unless you stop. So they're offered peace, and after they refuse it, then the judgment comes. So it's not genocide, it's judgment for what their evil actions are. So God's not just making room for certain people. He's actually implementing something of a divine plan for the salvation of the world, but he's offering people a way to get out of it and to not be subjected to this judgment. And they refused.
Yeah, I want to just point out, someone commented, I think a really good comment, Bill Conant, he said the mud was cleaner than that human touch, which is that's I
mean the mud that God creates and basically obeys his whim should he wanted to, in one sense doesn't have the rebellious heart that the human being did. There's what he did was a symbol of what's inside of him. That's a good, thank you, Bill.
Yeah, and I do find it interesting. I'll just say this real quick, and then I know we've got some more we want to get to, but
I'm looking at my phone just in case I miss any.
We've got some. But it is interesting that and you're mentioning Miroslav Volf, and it's interesting that people will sort of say, "Well, why didn't I see no evidence of God? Look at the world; it's full of these injustices, and God didn't intervene." And yet, they'll also say, "Oh, look at the Bible; these child sacrificing people." That after 400 years, God intervened, but in kind of a mean way. So he can't be good. If he intervenes, and if he doesn't appear to intervene, not that we would really know 100% if he does or not. Either way, the judgment is God is bad.
Yeah.
So it's kind of a no-win
it's
situation.
It's a heads I win, tails you lose. It's a Kafka trap in one sense, because if he doesn't respond, he's morally deficient. If he does respond, it's more evidence of his moral deficiency. And so we're looking for him to do something in this world. Why does he allow so much evil and suffering in the world? He doesn't allow. You know how much more there could be? I mean, it seems to me there could be so much more. But in the divine calculus, and we're not in a position to know this, in the divine calculus, he allows this much. Could he stop it? I guess. But there would be some other things that would be attendant, like the robbery of human free will. And a bunch of other things as well. So we're just not in a position to know whether the amount of suffering allowed in this world that could be for a greater purpose we're not aware of is an optimal amount, and how much is actually held at bay by God as well. So I think we have good reasons to believe, based on what God has done with suffering, and specifically in the cross of Christ, we see a God who's not aloof to suffering, but actually uses it for the salvation of the whole world. So I think that we have at least one bit of evidence, and we have many, many more, that things are allowed for greater possible purposes. God can turn these things around, as it were, but so much more is being avoided. We have no idea how much more is being avoided because of what God has done. In fact, he has done these things. There are stories upon stories upon stories of battles, of great wars. And I don't mean great in the positive sense. I mean just great in the magnitude sense, where things shouldn't have gone the right way, but they did. Who knows if that's not God's intervention in the middle of these things as well? So not only biblically speaking, but even in contemporary history, I think that there's at least some hint of these things.
Yeah, you just mentioned something that if someone's interested more in the, it could be much worse. And we can't always even recognize what God is doing. Just want to put it out there. There's Stephen Weikstra has this thing called the cornea critique. So someone could look that up, cornea, so it's a good acronym because it's about what you see, but it stands for condition of reasonable epistemic access. And it kind of gets to that. So if someone wants to go a little bit deeper on that question with Stephen Weikstra is a great Christian philosopher.
Spell Weikstra for everybody.
Oh, yeah. Wyksta.
Yeah.
And if you get C. Stephen Evans' Philosophy of Religion book, he talks about it in there, and that's just a great kind of introduction to that whole topic.
I just want to pause, pardon me, and just make sure we understood that there's much more that could be said about the Canaanite judgment, for example. And like I said, it's not just making room for people, but there's a judgment for their actions. Now, I've said elsewhere, I've written in books, but I'm going to say it here as well, is that we know this is not a matter of just simple tribalism or ethnocentrism or racism. In other words, God favors Hebrews over these other people because he lets them get away with murder, but he arbitrarily judges these other people for their sacrifices, because the biblical record itself actually has stories where the Hebrews and eventually Israel is judged by her neighbors. In other words, God judges Israel using Israel's neighbors as instruments of judgment when Israel does the exact same things that the pagans around them have done. So that's not a matter of favoritism. It's an objective morality. It's not, I like you people, you can do what you want. These people can't. That's not how the Bible works.
Yeah, and yeah, just real quick. And sometimes those people that it says God told them kill everyone, and then they killed everyone. Those people show up again later.
Yeah.
And so clearly there's more than meets the eye going on, and this gets into literary genre and idioms. And so there's
whether
there's
like Semitic hyperbole or Middle Eastern hyperbole and some of these things as well. So there's a lot more to it than that. But we cannot get rid of the fact that these are moral judgments, not just actions we can judge God for. No, these are actions that God is, these are actions that are evidence of God's judgment of immorality, which suggests that these things are objective.
Well, we've got this is a live question here from David on flight 777. And he writes,
he's flying right now?
Well, I don't know if maybe that's just the username he always uses, or maybe he is flying.
Oh,
maybe he's always flying on this flight and no one's found him. He's just hitching a ride all around the world.
Stowaway?
Yeah. So question, how do you refute the Epicurean paradox without using biblical perspective? And for those not familiar, I think the Epicurean paradox is just essentially if God is three things, all loving, all knowing, and all powerful, then he should stop evil. Since evil exists, God must not exist. And so it's those three. If you lose any one of those three things, then it makes sense. Well, either he's not powerful enough, he doesn't know everything, or he doesn't love everyone. So I think that's essentially what the paradox is. But he asks how you would answer it without using the biblical perspective. I don't know if he's getting at that he thinks the Bible's the only one that could answer it, or I'm not sure. But
yeah, so a couple of things. Let me just say this. What's his name again? I'm sorry.
David. I think is the
David. Thanks for the question. Valuable question. A couple of things. First, and I'm going to answer your question directly without using the Bible necessarily on this thing, but I want to point this out. As a Christian, I'm under no obligation to not use it. Because you wouldn't be guilty of circular reasoning if you used it. Here's why. If you're using the Bible to say the Bible says, and you just let it at that, and you don't ever go further than that, oh, God, it works out all things for those who love him and are called according to his purpose. Whereas the Bible says really positive things about God can use evil. Well, that if you just let it sit there, then yeah, okay, someone might say, well, fine, the Bible says it, but so what? That's what I'm trying to get at is how can God, especially the God of the Bible, exist when you say he's all good, he's all powerful, and he's all knowing, yet evil exists? And you're quoting the Bible to address this. That seems circular. It would be circular if you left it as it was. But I want to say this. You ought not be afraid of quoting the Bible if we can show that the Bible actually has good reason. What the Bible says makes sense, either within itself, the statement itself is just a good statement, or it's got corroborating evidence to it. So how would I respond to the idea, the Epicurean paradox?
Perhaps he just means to, like, philosophically.
Yeah.
So like if Alvin Plantinga were to, like that sort of a.
Well, and there's plenty of people who've actually responded to this,
right,
because it posits, at least, if I'm understanding this correctly, it posits at least the idea that an all-knowing, all-powerful, all-loving God can't exist in a world where evil exists, because if he was all-knowing, he would know everything that there was to know to stop it from happening. If he was all-loving, he would want it to stop happening. And if he was all-powerful, he'd be able to make it stop happening. So either he's not all three, or he's none of them at all, or he doesn't exist, right? So that's how I understand it to be, right? So how I would respond, there's a lot of responses, and the first one is this, is that the all-knowing part's really important, because the so-called logical problem of evil is the idea that a God who has those three characteristics is completely contradictory to the existence of a world where evil and suffering exists. We know that a world full of evil and suffering exists. Therefore, a God who cannot possibly exist in such a world must not exist in such a world. But that's the question. Is it contradictory to say that an all-knowing, all-loving, all-powerful God exists in a world with suffering and evil? I think the answer is no, and here's why. If the God is all-knowing, and all-loving, and all-powerful, we're none of those things. Okay, so if that's the case, then we are not in a position to know whether or not an all-knowing God has morally sufficient reasons to allow the amount of suffering and evil that currently exists in the world to exist for some greater possible good that might happen in the future, or will happen in the future, based on his fact that he knows everything. So what does he know? What he knows is so if this God exists, if an all-loving, all-powerful, all-knowing God exists, all-knowing, this is how I take the definition to mean. He's all-knowing in the sense that he knows all actual truths that exist currently. He knows what is currently true. He knows what was past true. He knows what is future true. He knows what will happen, but he also knows what could happen or what would happen. So that means that if God knows all of these things, if there's an all-knowing God, that all-knowing God will know all those things. And so if there is a God who knows all those things, then it's at least possible. And if it's at least possible, then there's no contradiction, because if I can find even one area where it's possible that God could exist in a world full of suffering, then it's not contradictory. So here's why I say that, because a contradiction is where two statements that mean the opposite can't both be true at the same time in the same way. So I can't say that I'm married and I'm a bachelor. I can't do that, because to be a bachelor is to be unmarried. To be married is to be not a bachelor. I can't be a married bachelor. That is mutually that is a contradictory statement. But if God knows the spiderweb of all of history, past, present, future, and future possible, then it's at least possible that God could allow suffering for a greater possible good. And we just can't see it, because we don't know all the spiderweb of past, present, future, and future possible history. We just don't know it. So we're in no position to actually say that it's impossible for that kind of a God to exist. Number two, if we say it's not possible that God could have morally sufficient reasons to allow certain suffering to exist, well, then now we've taken upon ourselves the mantle of knowing everything. And we're not in a position to know everything. We just simply don't. So here's the problem.
Yeah, it assumes a purpose to history, all human activity, creation, everything. Yeah.
But it even goes further because it creates its own paradox.
Right.
Because if you are using, if you say there's no possible world in which an all-loving, all-powerful, all-good God exists and suffering and evil exists, even to the extent that it exists on this planet, then you are saying you have infinite knowledge of past, present, and future. And if you have infinite knowledge of past, present, and future, then you're setting yourself up to be God. So here's the paradox. You're using your infinite knowledge of the past, present, and future to disprove the existence of a being who has infinite knowledge of past, present, and future. So to say it's not possible is to actually assume God's mantle. And that's the true paradox. So I think that the way to answer this is to say that if an all-knowing God exists and he's all-loving, he might have sufficiently loving reasons to allow suffering for a greater possible good we can't possibly fathom with our limited knowledge. And he uses his power to bring it about. So that's how I would answer it, is that all you need to do is have one possibility, and I think we have a sufficient possibility.
All right. Well, yeah, and I think, there was a comment too from that I think is kind of an interesting one here. It says from Andrew on YouTube, which kind of gets to maybe another side of the. It's not really the morality, but it is kind of the pain and suffering part. He says, pain, suffering, and evil are not reasons to believe there is no God, which you've just been talking about, but rather maybe reasons to be angry at God. Or these may be reasons to question the goodness of God. And yeah, how do we, because that is that's probably the most difficult
I think
question there is.
I think that is one of the most difficult questions there is, because it's hard to get somebody past their own pain. I know this from personal experience, of course. It's almost always impossible to, not impossible, but it's very difficult to address that and then say, here's some rational reasons why you should be okay with your suffering. Well, that's almost wrong to do that, which is sort of a pun intended. We're talking about objective morality, and I think it would almost might be wrong on that score. Here's what I would say to that, and I think that he's right about this. There was, I cite this in one of my books. There was a study done by, gosh, I'm forgetting her name. I think her first name is Elaine. Boy, I wish I could remember her name right now. Out of Case Western Reserve University, she did a study. This is years ago, on anger levels towards God. And what she had basically done was she took a study that across different denominations within Christianity and, of course, different religions, and said, I wanted to rate the levels to which people of different religions felt comfortable being angry towards God. And as part of that group, she included self-professed atheists. What she found was interesting was the atheists in this particular study ranked highest in their anger levels towards God. Now, someone might say, that sounds like a strange thing. How can you be angry at a being you don't think exists? Now, I'm not saying for a moment, and I don't think she would say either, that atheists are only atheists because they're angry at God. But there are a number of people who would claim to be atheists for whom God's non-existence is, for whom God's existence is insufficiently proven. That's not what's going on. What's going on is that it's not that I don't believe you exist. It's that you're dead to me. And that's powerful.
Yeah.
I mean, if you read Elie Wiesel's Night, Elie Wiesel still believes in God, but his faith was murdered.
Yeah.
And it murdered his God, his view of who God was, because of what he went through the Holocaust and all these things. And so I think this is a real phenomenon. In fact, in the study, they labeled these folks, not all atheists, but these particular folks, and there was a startlingly high number of them who were angry at God, as emotional atheists. Now, that is not a pejorative term. She's not saying this like in other words, they're just emotional people. That's not what she's saying. She's saying there is a significant number of people for whom God's existence is almost a point of anger for them because of what's been allowed to have it to happen in their lives. And that can be a significant thing. And yes, I think good, solid intellectual answers can address those issues. But the reality is, we have to have a pastoral sense and a caring sense to come alongside these folks as well. Syllogisms won't help in that particular matter and in that particular issue all the time. Although I will tell you, I share this story in Grand Social Question, where I knew somebody who just couldn't believe that God was good or cared about him and his family because, or his mother particularly, because she died when he was so young. And how could God value her? As we began to talk through the answer, which we began to see was the angst in his voice, not the anger, but the angst in his voice as to why he lost his faith at such a young age. His mother died. Hadn't been answered. In other words, he had not been satisfied. Well, I guess that's just the way it goes. That wasn't a satisfying answer for him. So what we had come to by the time our conversation was over was that suffering and loss does not have to be meaningless, but it can be something of value, that God can use these things for greater purposes because he already did. He let his own son die. The Father let the Son die. The Son willingly came on earth to die. So the biblical account is not aloof to this. It actually says suffering and evil can be turned into something good and glorious, which is the salvation of the whole world. And that is, I would say, I would posit in that form, a uniquely Christian thing to say. So if you're going through suffering and evil and you're thinking, is this just the way it is? Like, maybe, but I think there's good reason to believe that this isn't just the way it is. It's not meant to be this way. There's more to it than that. Yeah. And God has vouchsafed for us through the cross and the empty tomb, which millions upon millions have just celebrated a way out of that mess. So suffering is not something that God has not done anything about. He's actually done something about it.
Yeah. And I'll say, just like as a personal reflection there too, you know, there were many years where I wanted nothing to do with God because my brother died in a car accident and very hard for the whole family, and clearly. But there did come a moment where, you know, through looking into the resurrection, I started having other thoughts. But then I realized too, the existence of God dignified the pain that we were feeling and the suffering that we were feeling. And it dignified the value and worth of my brother, who I miss dearly, and you know, hopes to you know, get a chance to see again. And so it's not the reason that you become a Christian, you know, just because I hope that I get to see him again, but it did in some sense give value. It told me that something was wrong and that one day someone was going to fix that wrong. And it actually sort of agreed with the sort of natural feeling that, you know, if that's not true, we should be very used to death and suffering by now. But there is something within us that sort of recoils at it as if it's unnatural. That it's dreadful. What is that experience?
All these years, all these billions of lives lost, and the billions of days of mourning. One might say that accumulated misery, this can't be a God. But I think there's something more than just survival instinct, that we lament the fact that certain DNA machines stopped functioning. Our mourning is different than that. It is not just, boy, that machine stopped working, and I wish it still worked because it brought me some level of whatever in my life. There's more to it, and I think you do see that. We ask questions like, why? We ask, like, why? There's an innate sense in which we ask immediately, was there a purpose to this death? I mean, think of some of the saddest words you'll ever hear. He died for nothing. Those are sad words. But I think in the economy of in an economy where the divine actually exists, there's no such thing as he died for nothing. There's just no way. There's just a comfort that comes from knowing that all of this does, in fact, stem from a purpose.
Yeah.
I'm not saying that's the primary reason we should believe in something.
Right.
That's not a rational reason. There's a really good book by Clifford Williams called Existential Reasons for Belief in God, and where he actually gives a cogent argument for the existential reasons for believing in God are warranted. They're not evidential. They're warranted. In other words, you are warranted because of natural desires you have for comfort, security. These are not only natural, but they're perfectly rational desires we have. Yeah. And they're satisfied uniquely and I think abundantly and probably even and better than any other area in not only God, but in the Christian view of God. So you are warranted for believing in God because his existence provides these things for us. But the good news is there's also rational reasons to believe that this God exists, or evidential reasons outside of the existential reasons.
Yeah. Yeah. Great. Let's I wanted to mention, that just brought to my mind too, Jacob wrestling with God. I feel like that's what suffering does to us. It enters us into that relationship where we start to wrestle with God and sort of like Jacob, which, by the way, that's the meaning of the name Israel, is wrestles with God.
Yeah,
which is fascinating, and he refuses to let go until he gets his blessing.
Yeah,
and that's sort of what happens. And then you might walk with a limp for the rest of your life.
Yeah,
but you come away with a richer blessing for having gone through the wrestling.
That's right.
Strange. It sort of doesn't make sense rationally in one sense, but yet it happens.
Yeah. And looking back on it, sometimes there's a satisfaction, not a satisfaction, but there's a sense of peace that comes. And I'm not saying that's guaranteed to everybody on this side of heaven.
Yeah.
But there is something there. I think that is better than, oh, well, them's the breaks.
Yeah.
Well,
we're running out of time. We got time for one more, and I'm going to take Peter's question. There were a few left from some of the comments, but I think we kind of roughly touched on or got close enough to them to offer an answer there. But just in the brief amount of time we've got left, Peter asked, this is kind of a little off topic, but an interesting question. When do our souls go to heaven? Is that immediate? I asked because there are biblical references that the sleeping shall rise. I know it's I think kind of not what you typically talk about, but he's interested in that. And
good question, Peter. So there are references to this kind of thing, but I think that in some senses those are poetic. So they're literal in one sense and they're poetic in another sense. And I'm not being like sort of cagey when I say that, because, for example, we have some very specific language from Jesus where he's on a cross and there are two thieves who are next to him on that cross, and then one of them repents of his mockery of Jesus and sees the character with which Jesus endures his suffering, and he says to him, Jesus, when you enter in, remember me when you enter into your kingdom. And what does Jesus say? He says, I tell you, this day you will be with me in paradise. So that's not a very ambiguous thing to say. I mean, it's clear that Jesus knows this day I'm going to die. And by the way, this day you're going to die. And the day you die, you will be with me. So it suggests immediacy, that paradise, that existence in paradise is immediate. And then, of course, when Jesus dies, and there's one thing about him being, of course, the God the Son, but he's also the Son of God, and there's a human element to Jesus as well, the human nature part of Jesus. And when he dies, he says, Father, into my hands I commend my spirit. Into thy hands, I should say, I commend my spirit. So Jesus immediately goes as well. So there's a good indication that what happens right after we die is that our spirit is, in fact, in heaven. And of course, there's discussion about whether or not when those who have passed come back with the Lord, that they come back. They don't go up and then come down. They're not raised from sleep, so to speak. They're raised from the dead in that their spirit, their soul, which is not with their body, is reunited with their body, but it goes somewhere. It's not just dormant in a body. It's not there. so to speak. Now, I realize there and locations are a bit of a tougher thing because an immaterial body isn't necessarily limited to material space,
right?
But they're not connected anymore. Let's put it that way. So I think that the biblical counsel would weigh heavily in favor of when you die, your spirit goes to heaven immediately.
Yeah, and to be absent of the body is to be present with Christ, as Paul says. And there are even some instances in the Old Testament where it's sort of using some of this imagery of, oh, they're sleeping, but when you get images of Sheol, or like Christ does when he talks about the rich man and Lazarus, there you do see there's a consciousness still going on, even in this sort of pre-resurrection state, before people have started sort of.
And it's not even a dreamlike consequence where it's like this consciousness, I should say, where it's this weird, like, sort of bizarre, distorted view. The Lazarus and the rich man parable, the rich man's pretty conscious and he's pretty clear about things, and he's interacting with Abraham in a very deliberate way, and none of it's goofy or weird. It teaches a moral story. But I love that, to be absent with the body, to be present with the Lord. And in fact, Paul is wrestling with whether or not he should stay or leave based on his circumstances. So that suggests to you right then and there that sleep. By the way, one other thing on this too is that the definition of sleep. You know, when Jesus says of the young girl who is dead, and he raises her from the dead, he says she's not dead but only sleeping. He doesn't mean she's just comatose. She's dead. But when he says she's not dead but only sleeping, is it's as if she's sleeping when it comes to me, because all that the sleep of death in the poetical sense means is her spirit is not united with her body, but I have the power to do that. And then he goes ahead and does it. Yeah. So I think that's an important, great question. Thank you, Peter.
Yeah. Thanks. Well, I think that is all the time we've got. We're at 8:01. And so we're actually coming in. I know.
I'm proud of us.
Yeah. I'm trying to steer this ship a little bit more faithfully these days. So thank you all. Those were awesome questions. I'm only sad that we couldn't get to all of them, because there are more really good ones there. But we'll see you again in 2 weeks, where we're going to be talking about Neil deGrasse Tyson and some issues with creation in the Bible and science. So that'll be a fun one. By the way, if you haven't, and if you'd like to see more content like this, go ahead and share this, subscribe to the channel, click the bell, share it on socials, do all that stuff that kind of helps us get the word out. And as we've mentioned before, we are a donor supported ministry. So if you like content like this, and God so leads you, we would love for you to partner with us through donations, or prayer is the biggest thing we can ask for. So just, we'd ask you to pray about that and see what the Lord would have you do. And so would you like to end with any final words on this?
Just thanks everyone for tuning in. We've gone to an evening format. We'll see how the numbers turn out and see if this is the way to go. But ladies and gentlemen of the jury, it's been fun deliberating with you. Until next time.